All right. What is going on, everybody? We got Legends Find a Way podcast number 5 with Jess Demarchis, therapist and life coach, coming live from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. How are you doing today, Jess?
Doing good. Feeling good. The weather's nice. Got back from a run.
Right on.
So today's
Where did
good,
you and
man.
where did you run to again?
I ran along the river over by the Ben Franklin, the bridge.
So still getting out amidst the virus, huh?
Yes. Yeah.
Right on. And we're going to dive into a lot of that stuff today. But first, just wanted to get a little bit more in depth with you and kind of how you came into this place where you're obviously doing therapy and coaching. Because as a coach myself, this is a really interesting and unique combo that I see a lot of people take a side on, but not many people doing both.
Yeah.
So how the heck did that happen? Like, what does this journey look like?
Yeah, it's interesting because it wasn't linear. Like for me, I would say that I was kind of engaging in both worlds simultaneously, but keeping them separate for a really long time. I knew that they would complement each other eventually. I didn't know when or how I would do that, but I just had faith and I remained active in both. And so it really started when I was about 18 years old. I went to college. Studied social work in my undergrad, knowing that that was the quickest way to become a therapist, a psychotherapist. So that's what I did. And I knew that's what I wanted to do and how I wanted to serve people. So I just kind of like dove really deeply into that and followed the path and stayed committed and went to graduate school, like got licensed as a therapist, got all these certifications, started teaching therapists, like really active, streamlined in the clinical world, while also really heavy in the coaching world. I was 18 years old, working in sales and marketing, which you're aware of, which paid for the education. Hired my first life coach when I was 18, had a business coach, was coaching on the side here and there, and attending conferences and really kind of learning different modalities of personal growth and self-actualization from a coaching aspect, and saw the parallels. And so I just, again, I kind of like maintain both paths and knew that I could integrate them and that would be really powerful eventually. And I didn't know how or when until a few years ago. And when I saw an opportunity, I did that. But that's how it kind of happened. It wasn't like an idea popped off. It was really just that I had the opportunity to be grounded in both. And I just kind of stayed the path and knew that integration was possible and would happen eventually, and just kind of like waited for it to timing wise happen.
Right. That is so a lot to unpack there. And I want to start with this first thing because I think I understand how you knew, but I'm curious. What do you mean when you say like, I knew that's what I wanted to do when I was 18, right? Because people say, what do you do when you grow up? But then you were like, no, I want to do this thing. And you immediately took action on it. How did you know it was like 100% the thing you wanted to do?
So I love this question because let me clarify it. I didn't know what it would look like, what the title was, and how I would get there, but I knew what it was at my core. Right. Okay, so yeah, and I think that's a good distinction, because if I'm being honest, I don't know in a decade what it's going to look like, but I know what it's going to be.
Yes.
So what I knew was I wanted intimate connection with people who were struggling, and in a safe container space relationship, help support and facilitate change for them to live their best lives. So that's what I knew what it was. And through mentorship and opportunities and conferences, I skipped my prom to go to a leadership conference. Like I've always been in this world. So I kind of like, I was exposed to a lot of really cool people and was blessed with a lot of great opportunities and mentors. But social work was, in terms of perspective and theory, most in alignment with how I viewed doing that work.
Right.
So, and there was a lot of flexibility in that field. So that's how I chose that versus your traditional like psychiatry, psychology field.
Interesting. And so this is also interesting too, because first of all, I love all that. And I think it's cool to make the distinction, because I think like that is something that happens. It's like, hey, I know what I want, but I don't know what it is, what it's going to look like necessarily. I just know that like I have this vision per se of this thing happening, and like this is the path. But what's between here and the end of the line, that's sort of not necessarily 100% in the awareness yet. So I love the way you said that. But the next question is like epic to me. At 18, you were already investing in mentors.
Yeah.
How did that like come up? How did you get to a place where you're like, this is a good idea? Because at 18, like you just graduated high school or you're in high school. So you're used to like a mentor from your teacher. So how do you come to that conclusion? Like, I want to invest in a life coach and see what this is all about.
Yeah. So, well, two things. I think in high school, without getting into too much detail, I had a rough childhood. And so the education system really took me under their wing and offered a lot of supports and opportunities that I wouldn't have had otherwise. And they really kind of supported me in changing my lifestyle. And so I had mentorship in high school because of that. And so I saw the value in it. And when I became an adult and joined the sales and marketing field, I was exposed to different types of leadership and recognized that there is an entire field and people who do this for a living outside of therapy, AKA coaching and personal development and books and conferences and, webinars. And because of the company that I was in, everyone around me was working with coaches. And I was like, I want one of those. You guys are killing it. I want to kill it, And so through word of mouth, I hopped on a call with someone and found a way to come up with the money and hired my first coach, and the rest is history.
And so from that first experience, what did you gain? What did you learn about yourself?
I learned that with a plan and commitment to the plan, that I can achieve anything, literally anything. Yeah, it was so powerful and I still have it, by the way. Like when I was 18 years old, I have the notebook that I took my notes from my coaching calls. And it's crazy seeing that it was like, oh, by 40, I want this. I got that by like 27.
Wow.
So I don't even necessarily remember why I hired him and what we worked on, but that is the essence, where I just now truly have faith that when I make a commitment and decision and create a plan in alignment with that and show up and do the plan, work the plan, the thing that all of that action and effort and intentionality is behind will manifest.
Interesting. And I'm sure that you apply some of that stuff to some of your clients as well with the coaching and whatnot, I'm assuming.
Ideally, yeah. I mean, I work with a lot of different clients for a lot of different reasons, but I would say there's a little bit of that in all of it.
Cool. And I was going to actually ask you, that was my next question. So as far as like, working with these two, because again, like for those of you who aren't in the coaching space who don't know, like there are lots of people that are in therapy, that are clinical therapists, et cetera, that are they're very active on social media. And there are obviously tons of coaches, like every kind of coach you can think of. There's a coach that teaches you how to put your sock on faster. You know what I mean? Let's be real, right? So it's like, so as far as like what you bring to the table and how you kind of pair both those things, how do you think having your foot in each one of those endeavors, if you will, has made you a more balanced coach, or just your style, I should say, because it's not really even balanced, it's just your style. How do you think that's played into it?
I think that it's helped me have a more holistic view of the person and understand at a deeper level, on various levels, what got them to where they are now. And I think that how I choose to intervene is way more holistic, deep, and sustainable, as well as evidence-based. It's not based on my experience and what worked for me. It's based on what has worked for the last 100 years for individuals who find themselves experiencing X, Y, and Z due to A, B, and C. So I just think that I'm a little bit more versed in kind of root causes and what actually moves people forward sustainably.
Right. And that's where like the therapy meets the coaching, right?
Yeah.
In a way, right? Like therapy, you know what I'm saying?
And then the coaching, I think, it's like doing therapy on a treadmill. It's just a little quicker.
That's a really great analogy. I love that.
Yeah. So because therapy, takes a little longer, but here's the difference. in general, I'm generalizing, by the way.
Yeah, please.
When someone comes in to see a therapist, a lot of times the issue hasn't impacted their ability to function. And so the healing process might take a little bit longer, but sometimes too, they're also in an earlier stage of change. Like they might not even know the problem exists and or are wanting to work on the problem and or have just even started working on the problem. Now in coaching, again, generalizing, most people have way more awareness and are in a way further stage of change, meaning they've already been working on it and are just wanting the next step and or tips to maintain the progress they've made. And so because of that, time-wise, ideally, it can just be a little quicker.
Interesting. So I'm going to say a staircase in a way. It seems like therapy is just people who are newer to, and we'll just generalize again with like diving into themselves, right? Or like personal development in that way of like getting to know themselves on a deeper level, their issues, and then obviously learning how to solve them is up the ladder towards coaching or becoming more aware of them. And then thus the treadmill begins. That's sort of what you're saying.
Yeah. And the speed of the treadmill, like therapy is a little bit slower and there's a lot more, I'm trying to be mindful because like you said, I don't want to isolate the two because I think that they can really complement each other in a beautiful way. And I'm hoping that as the industry of coaching kind of progresses and things shift and move and groove, that they can learn a little bit from, psychology and therapy and vice versa. I think that therapy can learn a lot from coaching. But again, the treadmill analogy is that in general, I think it just happens a little bit quicker in terms of time frame.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's a really good analogy. And I like, I think that stems into some of the stuff that we talked about when we were having sushi early in March, because I know we were going in on all that kind of stuff.
Those people at that sushi restaurant, they got an earful. That was like the most epic sushi lunch I've ever had in my life.
That was savage. We went in. That was, it was amazing. We should have recorded that as well. We'll have to think about that next time. Okay. So obviously like you decided this is what you wanted to do. You moved forward with it and you decided at 18 that you wanted to do this, you moved forward with it. You started doing it. So how did you move into making this like your full-time career? How have you built that up? How have you started building your clientele and making it a business? I know you also offer retreats and whatnot. How does all that kind of flow in the timeline of your life thus far?
I was probably around 25, 26, and I was experiencing burnout as a trauma therapist. So that's my specialty, trauma work. So I was experiencing a bit of burnout and compassion fatigue, and I was also working like
1 second. Explain compassion fatigue.
So compassion fatigue, so there's a difference between compassion fatigue and burnout. Burnout is basically when you have like external stressors, which we all have, mixed with poor coping strategies on our part.
Oh, I love that. We're going to write that down to go. That's
So that's burnout, right? Now, compassion fatigue is where your ability to have empathy and perspective and patience for yourself and others is dwindling and or like non-existent anymore. Now, here's the beautiful thing about burnout and compassion fatigue. There are simple strategies and remedies that you can do right now. It's not a death sentence. It's not something that you have and now that's just is what it is and you need to change fields or jobs. Like you can work through that quicker than you think. But they can turn into really scary things if they're left unchecked. So that's where I was. I was like 25, 26, like already there. Now I don't want to say it was my fault. I made decisions to work in community mental health and also was working 3 jobs and also was working through my own personal life issues because I'm human. I was working during the day at a community mental health center doing trauma work for undocumented children and their families. So pretty heavy stuff. And then at night, I was doing in-home therapy with children who were expelled from school and or incarcerated. Also heavy trauma backgrounds and or like didn't speak English because I also speak Spanish. So mentally that was also just tiresome doing therapy in Spanish. And then on the weekends I was selling, you know, selling Cutco cutlery to, you know, really support my lifestyle, because I didn't live the life of a social worker. I'll tell you that. I was traveling and, you know, living debt free and, you know, really enjoying myself. But yeah, I put a lot on my plate and I wasn't taking care of myself. And because of the nature of my work and poor coping on my part, I burned out.
Wow. Yeah. I think first of all, you did a really great job of explaining burnout and compassion fatigue, because I think that those are things I don't think people really are aware of that probably deal with more than I think people probably deal with it more than they think they do.
It's about 71% of the occupational workforce in the United States.
What?
There's an ICD-11 code. So an ICD-11 code is a diagnosis that doctors use, and burnout falls under occupational hazards.
Whoa.
Yeah. So you can go to a doctor now, and if they are up to date on ICD-11 codes, they can diagnose you with burnout.
That's unbelievable.
It's intense. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you did this by 26.
Yeah. I did it by 26. Yeah. And so
Jess goes hard. That's definitely irrefutable. Keep going.
That's basically it. Yeah. I still go hard, but I also go hard with my self-care, hence why I'm not burned out. So, but I was burned out and experiencing compassion fatigue. And so I realized things had to change. And so I started just being mindful of the type of work I was doing and how I was investing my energy and just trying to create more work-life balance and better coping strategies on my part. So I started something called the Happy Social Worker, which was a self-care challenge where I did something self-care related every single day for 650 days in a row. And one of the big aspects that I learned about myself was how to say no and how to do less and really do more of what was in alignment with me and what brought me energy and was really tapping in and tuning into my gifts and talents. And so slowly but surely, it took about 1.5 years. I transitioned out of therapy one job at a time. Did a bunch of traveling, went back to become a yoga teacher, started taking on more coaching clients versus therapy clients. And as that business grew, I really scaled back the therapy, picked up on the coaching, and focused on evolving those business systems to integrate virtual coaching, in-person coaching. And now I do a little bit more retreat work with my year-long clients. But
wow,
you know.
Dude, that is what a transition. And I think I want to bring that into the focus. How did you you started moving out of that place because, or even better. So let's go back before that.
Mm-hmm.
So for the 658 days, 650 days. Okay. So were you doing the same thing every day, or was it something new every day, or how did you document it?
Yes. I documented it via Snapchat, which is super funny because I didn't even have a Snapchat beforehand, but someone kept saying, oh, it's like these 10-second videos. And all I kept thinking was, how am I going to hold myself accountable to doing this every single day? And I said, you know what, if you can't find 10 seconds a day, Jessica, you're doing something wrong. And so that's how Snapchat became the kind of platform for me to document it. But it's interesting because I had to really learn what self-care was for me, honestly. I think that I got caught up in this rhetoric of it being this physical feminine practice. So like day 1, I got a mani-pedi. Day 2, I, took a bubble bath. Day 3, I had a green smoothie. And then what? I could do it for the next 600 days. And so that's how I learned that self-care is really a holistic, flexible practice. And it's not just physical. And so I started tuning into what does my mental body need? What does my emotional body need? What does my spiritual body need? My financial, my relational, my vocational, right? Because self-care is something that ideally we're doing at the workplace too. And that sometimes it's boring. It was doing my laundry. It was cleaning out my pantry, going to the OBGYN, telling my mom, hey, like this conversation is no longer on the table between us, and really honoring those boundaries. So it was quitting a job. It was starting the business. It was, taking risks. It was traveling alone. So sometimes it was small, sometimes it was big, sometimes it was physical, sometimes it was mental. But my practice really grew with me, and my self-awareness grew because I had to tune in every day and say, hey, what do you need today?
Hell yeah. I love that. That is so cool. First of all, it's so cool that you called yourself out. And see, that's really something special, by the way. And I don't know, I know everyone has the ability to do so. And this is a question for, you know, pop culture, right? Of like, you know, generational, like what's this thing that says like, hey, I need to go a little harder, I need to push myself today. It's okay that I feel this way, but like, Jess, like 10 seconds, like what's that to you, where you could serve in that process and become more aware of yourself too, right? So that I think that the way you said it was key. And you said that, what is self-care for me? What is self-care for me, right? Because it's self-care, it must be this, it must be that. And what I've noticed is that humans are so good at downloading everyone else's plans and not doing their own, or not adjusting them to, okay, so this plan worked really well for this person and that person and that person, but am I the same? No. So therefore, what do I need to do to adjust? So what do you think about all that?
I think everything you just said, and what do I need right now? Because another thing about self-care that I think a lot of people mess up is that they do the same thing forever. So for example, yoga was a huge aspect of self-care for me years ago. Hence why I went back to become a yoga teacher, because it was such a pivotal practice for me in healing and taking care of myself throughout all that transition. If I'm being honest, yoga is still a practice that I incorporated in my life, but it's not my go-to self-care anymore. I'm at a different point in my life where silence, time in nature, like those are things that my body's craving. It's doing less.
So much less.
Exactly. So being able to tune in. Now, here's the thing also. When I have children, I bet you my self-care is going to change too. So it's being able to kind of tune in to what season I'm in, and honoring, again, what do I need right now?
Love it. And I love how you ask yourself that question. And we're talking about adaptability, which is super current with the events around the world right now. But the way that I always see it, and I think that you nailed it, and this is the way I look at it, is I like to call it like the flow within the structure, which I think I talked to you about before, where it's like, I know I have these personal development activities that I like to do every day, but I don't hone myself to the point where if I don't do them perfectly in this order, then my life is in frenzy, or I'm not doing it right. And I also don't keep them the same every day. I run a lot. I don't run the same trail every day. Every time I do something different, because every day is unique. Therefore, I have the opportunity to experience something new. And it's that newness, that freshness, that excitement of something that's mysterious, or, oh, I went a dead end, or there's a huge log that I never knew was there, I want to jump over it. That keeps that youth, at least in my eyes. So I love the way that you describe that. And I think it's truly remarkable that you spent 650 days doing that. So here's my question. What did you learn from that documentation process as far as how it was impacting other people?
I didn't think it would impact other people. And that just goes to show, you know, how do the work, show up, and share your processes, because you never know, because a lot of people suffer in silence. You never know who's going to benefit from it. So it was funny because I was just doing it for myself, and I'm the type of person where at that point particular, like my ego was like really flaring up. And so I knew that if other people were watching me, I would do it even if I didn't want to. And so that's how the social media as the accountability came into play. But it was funny because I actually missed a day, probably like day 20 something. And I had like 10 DMs. It's like, what did you do for self-care today? And I was like, oh my God, people are actually paying attention, watching. And then around day 100, people were like, hey, I want to start my own self-care practice. I'm going to go for 30 days. What do you recommend? Or what books? Or, you know, and it just kind of evolved from there. And now I actually like teach a seminar on it to therapists. And I've published research on it. Like it's really evolved into something that I did not even expect. Like we're changing the curriculum for master level social workers to incorporate this as a core competency, because if you are going to serve, you need to be able to take care of yourself to be in this field for a long time. And that's something that we'll teach you how to help people, but we're not going to teach you how to help yourself. That's just not sustainable. So it's interesting that this challenge started off just for me and has evolved into this like beautiful thing. But you know, I didn't know that when I started, but I'm grateful that I just had the courage to start and to follow the breadcrumbs.
Yep.
Yeah.
Love it. Love it all. Love that you on day 26, people started like asking you like, well, so what were you doing? And then I love at day 100, it's interesting. Like I always say this: lead and others will follow, because it's just how it works. And it's when you are working on yourself and serving yourself at the highest level, people naturally see that, and they see what you're doing for yourself, how it's impacting yourself. Thus, they start to realize, wait, why don't I do something like that for me? I wonder how that would work if I did it. And then on day 100, you have people reaching out to you. So what would you recommend? How do you do this? How do you do that? And then all of a sudden it seems like, wow, that little thing that I did, like you said, has turned into this mastery of self-care and learning what works for you. So here's the question: as of right now in your life, what are your go-to self-care? You said nature, and you said silence. Is there anything else that you've been applying?
Go-to has always been journaling. We talked right before we got on the call about how
you literally ran to get a journal. It's apparently, and listen, I don't disagree. It's essential in this time, and I agree.
For me, yes, journaling is an essential practice for me right now, especially as I kind of comb through my reactions and emotions, which are shifting during the uncertainty. And so journaling for me has always been a really great reflective process, and an opportunity for me, without shame and without judgment and without filtering, really honor whatever is present for me. And it's just something that I've been doing for like 12, 13 years now. So journaling has always been it, but yeah, silence, spending time in nature is huge. And you know, what's interesting, another form of self-care for me is not waiting. So let me explain. I feel like for a really long time, I always waited for the perfect moment, or I waited till everything was in alignment, or I waited to get recognition or validation from others that this was the right thing to do. And I feel like a form of self-care for me right now is really just honoring what's on my heart and doing it, and just allowing whatever's coming through to come through, trusting that it will work out, which if I really look back at my life, the evidence points to it's always going to work out. Like there's always. So just really kind of like not putting my life on hold, and really kind of honoring what's present for me, and doing not what I should do or could do, but what do I want to do. So that's a form of self-care that's new, but it's exciting, and I've been tapping into it for the last few months, and it's just been a nice addition to some of those more, as you can tell, where I'm at now, grounding, centering activities.
Yeah, and they're amazing. I love them, and I'm curious as to how you approach them, because I think that for especially the audience here, I mean, we're talking my crew, pillars of growth, mind, body, spirit stuff, personal development activities, and we're talking about journaling often, silent reflection, etc. So what's your approach to journaling? What's your approach to silent reflection? You can start with either or, just to give some context, and then also some shed some light onto how you do it, how you implement it, and how it's impacting you.
I'll speak a little bit about silence and journaling. So for me, journaling, there's so many ways to do it, and there's no right or wrong, honestly. If you just put, you know, I feel blank today on a piece of paper, like, you are a journaler. Like, that is journaling, you know. But there are like great prompts. There's daily journals. There are the techniques like the 5-minute journal, where what are 3 things you're grateful for? What's one thing you want to accomplish? I've used those in the past, but my journaling currently is really just, again, it's a safe container for me to show up as I am. And so a lot of times I just put the date, and I start with like a reflection of the day, and or start with kind of how I'm feeling, and I free write until I feel a little bit of space. And sometimes that's 2 minutes, sometimes that's 2 hours. And I write as I think. So sometimes it's a little bit of jibber jabbish. Sometimes I would never want anyone to read them, because sometimes it's abrasive. But again, like, that's the, power in the practice for me, is that it truly is a safe space where I don't have to be a therapist, a coach, a girlfriend, a daughter, a sister, an aunt, a teacher, an educator. Like, I can really just be as raw as I want to be in those moments. And so that's kind of my journaling practice. It's not anything fancy, actually, quite the opposite.
Yeah, it sounds very flowy. And you said something really interesting. You said you usually go till you feel space. What do you mean by that?
So I know for me, I hold tension kind of between my throat and my diaphragm. Usually it's a sense of difficulty taking a deep breath, and or a little bit of pressure, and or a little bit of like flutters under my lungs. And that's been through a lot of introspection and you know, meditation and journaling and these practices to really tune into my body and understand kind of how I experience things. And so because I've done that work, I can pretty quickly identify when that's happening. And so when I experience space, it's when I'm actually able to take a deep, slow breath without effort.
Interesting. And sometimes you achieve that in 2 minutes or 5 minutes or however long.
Yeah. Sometimes just by writing, like, I'm pissed today, or I'm sad today, or, you know, I'm frustrated that this isn't going the way I want to. Like, sometimes just writing that out and actually feeling again by the pen and paper, validate it, that that's okay. Just that alone, just identifying the feeling provides the space I need.
Interesting. I love that. I love your approach. It's very, like I said, flowy in the sense that there's a structure, aka the journal, and within that structure, you flow and just let it be as it is, or be how you are. And I really like what you had to say about that, because I think that it's interesting as you be. From what I can tell of things in general, of skills, the further you go into it, the more vague it becomes in a way. And then you start to realize that, you know what I'm saying? Then you realize like within that, there is something there, but when you try and grasp it is when you can't grasp it. Right. So I think you get that. And also it's like a huge thing in martial arts. They talk about it all the time. It's like,
really?
you drill the fundamentals into the point where it's now just like an open book.
Wow.
Because
I love what you said, because I feel like that gives words of what I'm experiencing. I feel like the older I get and the deeper into the work I get, the less structure and pressure and kind of effort there needs to be around it. Like, there's this sense of ease.
Yeah. It's been, I journal very similarly, and it's probably been one of the biggest differences between what I used to do and what I do now. What I used to do being like the structure I created, thinking that was what I was supposed to do, keyword, what I'm supposed to do, versus realization that actually provides me no feeling. I don't feel it, but when I write, I feel it and I allow it to flow through me, and whatever is happening comes through me. And before I know it, I've literally changed my energy, and I've become something more because I've experienced it in the organic way versus forcing it to be a certain way.
Right.
And like that, I think you said it really well. And anything with martial arts, like I said, you read any of the classic literature on martial arts, they all the greats talk about it in the same way of eventually getting to a point where like all techniques become just kind of like this one flow that you create and cultivate. So love that. As far as the silent reflection, how does that play out? Because I think that's really misunderstood. It's something that you get when you do it. You're like, oh, this is obvious, but explain that a little bit. And like, how do you do it? Where's your space in it? Like, how does that work?
I would say there's two different practices. So the easiest for me right now is when I'm in nature. So getting outside of my space per se, and literally transitioning into a space where I can feel connected to a bigger picture and feel simultaneously connected to the bigger picture and ground it to the simple aspects of life. And nature does that for me. Usually I can just see a plant, and because again, this has been a practice, I can see a plant and that will do it for me. But getting out in nature, transitioning into a different space is really helpful. And then I just use my 5 senses to get grounded. So I really pay attention to what are things I can see, colors, words, people, things I can hear. Can I hear the birds? Can I hear the cars? Can I hear the water? What can I smell? What can I touch around me? If I'm usually, like, I'm a coffee drinker, I love coffee. So like, guilty confession. Well, not guilty, just so you know a little bit about me. Like, love coffee. Usually have some type of like beverage in my hand. So typically coffee, I just love, it's such a soothing taste for me. So I'll really focus on kind of like what kind of coffee I got that day, the texture. So I use my senses to ground me, and then I'll just sit. And it's actually in the beginning extremely difficult practice. So let me say that it is not easy. It's uncomfortable. That's why people don't do it. We are doers, not beings. We think without actually thinking our thoughts or feeling our feelings. We just become reactionary. And so this is a very simple, available practice that's very difficult. And so I understand, and I hold compassion, and I encourage people to do 1 to 3 minutes. Just start with 1 to 3 minutes, and then go from there. But really, it's just a practice of sitting and noticing my thoughts without getting carried away by them, identifying the feelings without judging them, and just trying to be with my breath and being with the 5 senses. So being with the sounds of the birds, being with, you know, the feel of the wind or sun on my skin, and just allowing myself to spend as long as I've allotted in that space, and just truly enjoy being. And again, when I get carried away by thought and or find myself judging an emotion or trying to push it away or get too much into it, taking a breath, acknowledging that that's human, and just coming back over and over and over again.
I love that. And I love your interpretation of, and we'll just call that a silent reflection in the way you described it, especially with the five senses. That's a very mindful practices, right?
Mm-hmm.
And my question is, like, where did you learn that? Or is that something you just kind of stumbled upon? Because I love your approach to it. And I love what you said about coffee, because that's something that I think, oh yeah, coffee's so awesome. But the way you appreciate coffee, like, that's the mindfulness behind it. Like, I love the taste. How did this fit? And like, that's what gets you all of a sudden out of that place where now you're just flowing with everything. So where did you learn some of these techniques? Because that's extremely applicable.
Yeah, I learned them through a combination of things. So again, my training is as a trauma therapist. And one of the biggest things about trauma is that it changes brain chemistry, and it's really hard to be present. And so mindfulness over the last 30, 40 years has really been proven, like, common sense makes sense, but in terms of like science, with neuroscience in particular, being able to prove this now, been shown to be one of the most effective forms of therapy for individuals with trauma. And so being able to come back to the present moment, be grounded, feel the body, and not get carried away by the thought, the flashback, the memory, and therefore the body reacts in that way to that traumatic event that is not happening right now. And so I learned about it in terms of theory and books and research a long time ago in undergrad. But then when I actually started doing therapy, practicing therapy, realized, oh my God, I need to know how to do this. And because I see it, I need to be able to meet my clients where they're at and implement this modality, but I don't have a personal practice. And so I started practicing yoga, and particularly in studios that had a mindfulness element, like there were meditation classes, and we started with breath work, ended with breath work. And also I got trained in mindfulness-based stress reduction through Jefferson University, which is, again, just another form of treatment and therapy that's based in science, and there's a little bit of structure to that. And so, and I've been teaching that. And also a big component of my work was self-compassion. And self-compassion, one of the 3 aspects of self-compassion is mindfulness. And so it just kept coming up as a therapist and then personally. And so again, that integration really made it a powerful aspect of not just my life, but how I serve others.
Interesting. Boy, you have I love how all these 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1, you just keep adding them up to create this new, this your own, and like you said, your own version of it, right? And I think that's just so special. So how do you implement some of that stuff with some of your clients and some of the work that you do with them?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you an example. One of my clients tonight, I know she's a little bit more anxious than some of my other clients. Let me say that. She tends to worry a lot more. And so one of the things that we do before we even start session is I always ground her using a mindfulness activity. And so before we even start doing coaching, I want to make sure she's in a centered place. That way she's not using the time to just rattle off the things that she's worried about, but that she's actually present and honoring what's coming up for her so that we can do deep work. So that's one way. Another way is just personally, I do a lot of group work in my coaching as well. And so I need to be present because yes, it's one-on-one coaching on a stage, but I am aware of group dynamics, even if it's virtual and even if we're quote unquote taking turns. And so that practice has helped me show up, particularly in that format of coaching, group coaching, really well, because I can catch reactions. I'm aware of how things or sounding and how that might have triggered a client. So let me circle back and check in with her. Like, I'm just so, now I'm not perfect, I'm human, and I have rituals to get me in state, but I would say, without sounding egotistical, like, I'm better than most in being present when I'm working.
Gotcha.
Yeah. I think a lot of people, they listen to respond versus listen to listen.
Right.
And that's just not the best way to serve clients in that capacity. And I'm very intentional to catch myself when I am going the wrong way.
So here's the question. Do you think that they're aware of that? Those people who are listening to respond versus listening to listen. Do you think they're aware that they're not actually listening?
I'm unsure. Unfortunately, I would say that the majority probably aren't. And I would think some are, but they haven't done the work to be able to manage it.
How do you think, how do you explain the differentiation between the two?
Yes. How do I explain the difference? I would say when you listen to listen, you aren't formulating what you're going to say back. Like the self-talk is their talk, right? So like if we're talking about what you had for dinner,
right.
I'm not saying like you go, oh, well, you know, I went to McDonald's and I shouldn't have, but I had a McFlurry. I'm not thinking, you know, oh, like how many calories are in a McFlurry and, you know, how do I hold him accountable to not eating a McFlurry? I'm actually just hearing you say he feels bad and he knows he shouldn't have, but he had a McFlurry, right?
Yeah.
So I think the internal dialogue is what they're saying versus what you're wanting to say back.
Right. Hearing what they're not saying, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I love the way that you describe that. And especially I think the example is really good. How do you think, this is the question. So I'm sure that you and I have both been in the situation where I definitely used to listen to respond 100%. Even when I first started what I was doing, because I just wasn't aware of the fact that I wasn't actually listening. It really wasn't even until for me, my girlfriend really opened me up to that, because I started to realize how well she was listening to me, and it started making me think like, I don't really listen anywhere near as well as her. Do I not listen to other people too? Mm-hmm. Right. So how did you become aware of that, and how did you differentiate and start to put yourself in a position where you were listening to hear what they weren't saying, so that you could really become of value to them by actually being there with them in the moment, versus being in your own thoughts of like, hey, you know, oh, you weren't supposed to eat that thing. Why'd you eat that again? What's your issue? You know what I mean?
Yeah. This took time, and I'm not perfect. It's actually interesting. I apologized to a client on Friday because I felt like I was listening to respond and not listening to listen. And so I called her back and I said, hey, that wasn't the best session. I'm sorry. Like, I wasn't grounded before we got started and I got carried away and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not perfect, right? But it is a practice. And I would say that I started the practice early on as a therapist, and it probably took about like 2-3 years, but in particular, I needed to get really good at it because I was doing trauma work. And like I said, without getting into too much detail, I have a pretty extensive trauma history myself. And so when I was working with these children and teenagers who had very similar upbringings to me, I had to really listen to listen and be mindful versus getting carried away and triggered by my own experience and relaying information based off of, like, we call in therapy countertransference, where now I'm transferring my experience and filtering the information and hearing it in a biased way, versus really kind of listen to listen, holding space and being present in their experience and monitoring my reaction. So that's kind of a heavy answer.
That's terrific.
But that's how it happened.
Was there a certain circumstance in particular for you that you experienced this for the first time and you were like, whoa, like that aha moment of like, whoa, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. There's a ton, but one in particular is I was working with a girl who culturally was the same, family dynamic, we were the same, and our trauma histories were the same. And I found myself listening to her, and two things were happening. One, I was getting emotional because I recognized that I was being for her what I wish I had. And that made me sad for me versus holding space for her.
Wow.
And then I started responding in a way that might not have been the most therapeutic, where I was taking ownership of, it's my responsibility to help her and serve her and intervene and stop this, versus my responsibility of supporting her through this. So I almost had this like motherly instinct versus therapeutic instinct, and that needed to be checked. So that's just one of many, because again, I'm human and this is tough work. But that's, I can literally like right now even like go back and remember that exact session.
Wow.
Yeah.
And how long ago was that?
I must have been like 25, so 5 years ago.
Wow. That's crazy how you can remember something so vividly when it has that kind of impact, and that kind of like, wow, this is like one of those moments that I wished I had, but I'm doing it in the reverse situation. And it's just like, and I think that's like when you get into psychology and you really start to go deeper with everything, things become just so much more interesting and really, really wild how humans can take things, twist them, make them their own, and without realizing it, all unaware. And then you become aware of it. You're like, what was I doing? How did that happen? And like, what, you know what I mean? Just like talk about silent reflection. We're going to need some, you know what I mean? We're need a journal, because that was heavy, right? That was crazy. So I really like the way that you described that. And I think that the different, I should say this, the idea of listening to listen, I think right now is more applicable than ever. And it's really cool to hear you doing that in your practice, and not just with the therapy, but also now with, you know, your actual clients for coaching. Because I think that in the coaching space, like that's probably by far the thing that I see the least of, is people actually listening. And we've had this conversation last time. Yeah. People actually listening and really offering the support versus just telling you what to do, teaching versus telling, right? And, you know, we can kind of move into more of that here in a second and talk about some of the Corona stuff. But as far as like the transition for the last time from therapy to coaching, what do you feel was like the pivotal thing that puts you in position to feel like I want to lean more on this side than this side?
The flexibility. I think therapy is shifting in a really beautiful direction, again, with like neuroimaging and what's actually effective, and more of these holistic modalities that really look at the person as a whole, and not just from this like attachment theory, but really person and environment and genetics and race and all the things, and integrating and intervening in a way that incorporates all of that. And that's why I keep a foot in the therapy world, because I love it so much. But in terms of the type of lifestyle that I'm wanting, and I feel like I deserve, coaching just allows more space for that. There's more flexibility in who I work with and when, and less restrictions on how I work with people. And price-wise, it's just more of a lucrative industry. And also, over the last few years, and we've talked a little bit about this, I've felt this pull to really add value to the coaching industry, in terms of showing up in a way where I am integrating and kind of bringing in more evidence-based interventions and modalities to the work, versus, like you had said, teaching and telling and selling versus coaching, because I do think coaching is an art and a skill and requires practice. And so that's more on like a deeper level why I've made the transition. But if I'm being honest, it just allows me to live the life that I'm really desiring.
Right. And I think that you're a real inspiration for any therapist out there who might be listening to this. Like, yes, you can. Right. Because I know even the people that I know that are therapists, like they're kind of looking over the fence a little bit sometimes, like, you know, because, and we can dive into that, like the restrictions of therapy versus the the very vast repertoire of options you have as a coach to help people, like you said, move forward versus like the initial digging and like sitting and being versus like, okay, now we're being and moving at the same time, right? Which is like almost reteaching someone how to live in some ways, which is kind of interesting. I never thought about it like that before. So here's my question. So with everything going on in the world right now, how has your coaching adapted and changed in this time with the COVID-19? Because the last time I talked to you, we were having an epic sushi time, and that was the beginning of March. And now I'm in California, and the whole world's on fire.
I know. We were just talking about this. I feel like we just had lunch 30 days ago, and we were talking about jamming out on this podcast, not even thinking about the fact that this would be a topic. It's interesting how quickly things shift, but how ordinary, that's life, you know. It's been interesting because I feel like I'm trying to hold space for my clients during everything that's going on, where it's, hey, let's remain accountable to still showing up and living your best life and kind of staying grounded in our work while supporting them through the uncertainty, which for some of my clients is higher than others. And so it's been interesting where I find myself being just a tad bit more lenient while still kind of holding them accountable to doing the work. But I'm just trying to kind of understand that for some of my clients, their experience of what's happening is real, and not that it's not real for all of us, but it is real and it's challenging and it's scary. And so I'm trying to hold space for that while still supporting them and doing the thing where it's like, hey, we don't stop because, like you had said, things are shifting. How do we just readjust?
Yeah. As far as some of those people that, you know, when you say like more lenient, what do you mean by more lenient?
Where instead of giving them homework assignments to do more, I'm giving them homework assignments to do less. So for example, like my one client, it's like, hey, instead of like creating this opt-in and spending hours creating a welcome email chain, it's, you know, can you get off social media by 9 p.m.? Can you, you know, take an hour to go outside and walk the dogs? Can you like sit down and have dinner with your wife? Like we've been talking about working so hard to create, where now you have the time and space to actually just do it. You know, like, can we just be, do a little bit less right now? We're still doing it, but it's just, can we just do less?
Can we just be, right?
Yes.
It's interesting. It's kind of crazy. Like the COVID-19 is almost doing the work for you. So there's less that you need to do, right? In theory, but are they aware of that is the question, right? It's like, oh yeah, we've been looking to do this dinner time with my wife, which by the way, to me is like epic that like that has become something that needs to be really addressed, when like that's clearly one, if not the most important thing, is like the connection you have with the people that you live with, and like keeping it, and like more importantly, like cultivating it every day, right? So I love that. That's a great example. And I think it's really interesting the way you described it, like being a little more lenient. In reality, more lenient is actually putting a lot more pressure on them to like sit still, because we talked about that earlier. And I love what you said about that. It's a simple practice, but extremely difficult, right? And, you know, like that's the challenge. Like I'll give you $100,000 if you can sit still for 30 minutes. Like who could do it?
Yeah.
That should be a show. That would be epic, dude. Or like if you could like monitor their like thoughts and see if they can actually focus on being present.
Well, there are machines that do that. Don't quote me, because what are they called? Are they called the M waves or biofeedback? Anyway, they put like a pulse oximeter on your finger, and they put these things on your temples, and it monitors your brain waves, and it tells you, like, it chirps birds in your ear when you're getting carried away by thought, and it tracks how long you can sustain like focus.
Interesting.
Yes. And I think you could probably like, you don't need like a script from a doctor. You can buy those on like Amazon, but yeah, I'd be curious. I think people would struggle more than they think.
Oh yeah. And I think that's a reflection of what we're seeing right now with everything going on. And that leads me into my next question. So, I mean, obviously that's sort of how you're adjusting with the clients. It sounds like also the fact that you made this move to doing more of the coaching and also puts you more online, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So how has that impacted your natural order of doing your actual work from a day-to-day kind of basis?
I think that I've had to be very intentional about creating the same container that I do in my office that I do in a Zoom room. So I would say that that is one of my gifts. Like I can create a container to facilitate change very quickly. And it's something that I worked really hard on and I'm very intentional about. And I think it's what helps me do the type of work that I do so quickly. It was tough transitioning to be able to do that virtually, but I just thought, what are the things that I do in my office and how do I do them virtually? And the reality of the situation is that I can do most of them virtually because the way I create containers are listen to listen. I create clear expectations. I am mindful of using language that's judgmental and or shaming. My eye contact, my body language, having consistent setup so that they know what to expect when they see me. Monitoring my breath, like those are all things I do to creating container in an office, and I can do them in a Zoom room. It just takes a little bit more effort because technology is distracting and overwhelming for most people, myself included. So I just have to kind of, you know, like even now, if you look at my setup, like when I'm quote unquote working, all I have is a hot beverage, a candle, and my computer. That's it. I have my stabilizing elements that just trigger that we're getting focused and we're working, and what I need, which is a computer.
Interesting.
I don't have things that are distracting. My phone's not by me. Like it's just, I'm here with you right now. And that's it.
And is that how you had it in your office as well?
Yeah, my office was very minimal. I had warm colors. I had a few books, but the idea was to be as soothing as possible. Like I wanted it to feel like a safe, open, soothing space.
Right. That's very cool. And I love the way you described it. I was actually going to ask you about it because I don't think people necessarily understand what that means, holding space. But I think you described it really brilliantly. And I like the way that if everyone just re-listen to this, because Jess is saying some really important things that anyone can practice when you're looking to create a meaningful connection, right? It doesn't have to be like just in a therapy or just in coaching. This is like how to listen 101. This is like how to be more grateful and more abundant in your life. Listen to someone else's actual life and you will naturally become more grateful and abundant in that regard, right? So as far as that, I mean, so you've been able to move your business slightly and just twist it just a little bit. Were you already doing some online sessions beforehand?
Yeah, I was doing phone coaching.
What? That's
in the beginning. Yeah, because that's how my first life coach was. He had a phone and we talked via phone, and he called me at the time. I wasn't allowed to call him. And yeah, so I started coaching on the phone, and then I got an iPhone, so I did FaceTime. But now I've moved everything virtually. That way I can have some boundaries in my business. Most of my clients don't have my personal number. Gotcha. They can access me and I'm accessible and responsive, but that is a boundary I've learned over the years.
Interesting. What led you to that boundary?
Well, two things. One, in therapy, that's just a boundary that I've always had. So that was actually interesting, transitioning into coaching, getting more comfortable with self-disclosure and being vulnerable online, and really allowing my life to be the model for what I'm talking about. That was uncomfortable at first, but I leaned into it when I saw that how it really touched people and people felt seen and heard. But yeah, clients were just texting me and calling me, and I wasn't, when I would respond, when I wasn't in the space to respond because it's my personal phone, I wasn't necessarily responding in the way that I would have if I had sat down and been like, okay, you are responding to clients.
Right.
So I just kind of probably a year and a half ago decided to create some systems in place where they can contact me pretty quickly, just not my personal number.
Interesting. And I like that you found that made the distinction. And I know now that you mentioned it, for all the therapists I've talked to, it's like a really big thing in therapy is like, you don't have outside communication and you're not really allowed to even acknowledge each other, correct? They can acknowledge you, but you're still not really allowed to go any further than that, right?
Right.
Real boundaries in the space. And if you break that, you can lose your license, correct? Something like that?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that you, so, I mean, wow, like for you, like that's like a paradigm shift and a
Yeah,
half. Like, oh wait, so I
huge.
can do this? Like we can do more? Like, hi?
Yeah,
Right?
literally. I remember the first time like hugging clients or like, you know, I remember the first Facebook Live I ever did. I literally was shaking because I was talking about my relationship, which is crazy because to be human is to be in relationship, right? You know
Yeah,
what I
no.
mean? But yeah, I remember doing my first Facebook Live and just thinking, oh my God, people are going to know what happens inside my house and being terrified. I remember, you know, thinking when I get married, am I going to wear my wedding band to session? Do I want them to know I'm married? You know, when I decorate my office, do I want to put something like a yoga mat in there because then they're going to assume that I'm Buddhist? You know what I mean? So like, I think about things so deeply because of my background. So yeah, it was a huge paradigm shift when I went into coaching where people are like, I want to know all about you, because a lot of times they hire you because there's something about you that is attracting them to work with you. And it's my responsibility to show up and share and, you know, be there in that way, particularly with coaching. So it's been an interesting shift. I still get uncomfortable sharing, by the way, but I'm a lot better about it now.
That's such a great anecdote. I love that. That was awesome. Yeah, no, agreed. And I think it's so interesting that you think that deeply about each and every one of those things. And that just shows the care in which you take for your clients and your business, and how you really value that professional setting, and you don't want to let it get misconstrued, because for sure, one of the biggest issues that's out there right now is like people getting way too close. And then the relationship dynamic shifts so drastically from where it began that you can no longer actually get to where the whole original idea or the original plan was to go. You
Right.
can't get there because the relationship is now shifted into a way that's like kind of convoluted, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. I have a client who literally lives a block from me, and we've never done an in-person session. Now, don't get me wrong. Like, you know, that's not something that's off the table. It's just that's how we've kind of communicated around having boundaries.
This is so interesting for me. I'm having all these thoughts about how I do it unconsciously. So we'll talk about that later, because that's
Yeah.
interesting. I don't want to make it all about me, but interesting thoughts, especially a block away. That's really cool.
I know.
I think it's neat how you've made this transition. Again, I'm very, very interested in it, because I know just so many therapists who have been peeking over the fence, and it's like, why wouldn't you, first of all? And now all of a sudden they're like, oh my gosh, we can use Zoom. And it's like, yeah, we've been out here. Like
Yes.
this is the next level. Like you can
Yeah.
we can just, it allows more time for you to be, right? You don't have to physically hold the space all the time. Like with that extra amplifier of like, we have this in-person confined spot I have to go to. Now after this call, I can immediately go back and do a place that I want to be in.
Right.
Right. Which my own little zone, my own little flow, which is another conversation. But as far as what you're seeing right now in the world, what are some things that you're seeing for people that they're doing, or some practices besides what you already spoke about with some of your clients doing less, that you're asking people to do to combat some of the fear that's associated with coronavirus, et cetera?
One of the things we talked about really briefly before we kind of hit record was really trying to stay grounded in what our experience is versus what the collective experience is. It's interesting because I'm trying to be very mindful of what I'm sharing, because full disclosure, like I am experiencing this too simultaneously. And even though I would say that I'm pretty grounded in everything that's happening, you know, I'm shifting as it rolls out too. So I might in 3 weeks respond very differently, but this is just where I'm at right now. And so I just want to kind of acknowledge that and say that. That way, you know, I'm not that I don't want to be held accountable, but it's like, you know, you said that. And it's like, well, I said it based on what I knew. We're 3 weeks in.
Right.
So,
Right. Fair enough.
Yeah. So with that being said, staying grounded in what your experience is, I think that as a collective, particularly with the role of technology and social media and the internet, there is a heaviness, and the predominant rhetoric is fear-based and what could happen and worst case scenario, and maybe even a little bit of catastrophizing. Now, again, not invalidating the reality of the situation, just trying to hold space for how some people may be kind of amplifying it a bit, and how can we stay grounded in our experience versus the collective fear, worry, and angst around what's happening. And so for some people, there is more fear and uncertainty and maybe financial struggles or health concerns. I would say for the majority of people, there is some space and time being allotted to us, which is something that we, at our core, I think, have really been craving. And so what do you kind of want to do at this time that we'll probably honestly never get again? And how can you stay grounded in what your experience is? Like we were talking about, like, do you have food in your fridge? Do you have technology? Do you have a safe home? Is your health good? Like, is your children's education truly being interrupted to the point where they're going to be like behind in life? Like, you know what I mean? Like, are you working from home and still getting paid? Is it not income tax season? Like, are you still able to pay your rent? Like, you know, what is your experience versus the collective angst and or the very difficult experience of some right now? Does that make sense?
Yeah. No,
Yeah,
I think
okay.
I think that does make sense. And I like what you said about really breaking it down and looking at it from your perspective. And I think it was really interesting what you said. You said that we may never get this and ever again, this opportunity, which is like such an interesting thought. I didn't really think about it. I was like, oh, maybe this will just be the new norm. I wasn't even thinking about, hey, this is going to go away, because obviously it will at some point. And then, like, will we ever have a time again where we are kind of forced into this isolation / lockdown, and forced for those of us who don't already do this to look in the mirror more often, literally and figuratively, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the most interesting things about working from home is that you get to look in the mirror all the time, right? And you do it all the time. But for most of us, I feel like we can easily escape that, right? By going to work, by being busy, et cetera, all the things that we like to do so much, or more importantly, and we talked about this earlier, or you mentioned this earlier, is we've just been conditioned to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just conditioned to do instead of just be, right? You don't even get conditioned to be, you just are, you know what I mean? So like forgetting how to do, right? So I think that that's really interesting. My question to you is, like, you know, and obviously this is speculation because it's 3 weeks in and we don't know what's going to happen. A month ago we were having sushi and it was awesome, by the way. Really great sushi. Shout out to Vic Sushi. Sweet potato roll was what's up, right?
You did convert me. I will say, I will always get a sweet potato roll now.
So
Side
good.
note.
If they do it right and it's crispy, arguably the best roll that anyone can have as a compliment to the other rolls.
Yes.
I just had that realization. It's definitely a compliment. I wouldn't just go and get just sweet potato. I get like this and the sweet potato, like avocado sweet potato. Actually, that's a good idea. The avocado sweet potato roll would be epic. That should be a thing. Anyway, I digress. As far as like where you see things moving forward here, how do you feel like the collective consciousness right now is like shifting in some ways? Because I know earlier we talked that like everyone's on the same wavelength in the sense that we're all facing this globally together. How often in history are we all thinking about the same thing?
Right. Like, I think that there are situations that as a nation bring people together where that is the predominant thought. But I don't know if I've ever experienced something on this scale where it's been global. So it is interesting. Right now, again, trying to be mindful of that this may shift. Right now, if I'm being honest, I'm kind of split. I feel like on one half, unfortunately, I think that this will, not that this is a fortunate event, but unfortunately, I think this will pass and people will revert back. And so on one end, I think that that's a possibility. And on the other hand, again, I think I'm split. I'm hopeful that after people have had a taste of this, they will want to find ways to integrate it more. Like on one hand, I'm like, we just went from working to home. Like, how many mothers of young children are going to go back to a 40, 50-hour work week? How many people are going to want to travel across the country and stay in a hotel room when they could do a meeting via Zoom? Or how many people are going to want to sit through a 3-hour meeting where it can just be a chain of emails? Like, I really wonder how we are going to integrate this. I'm hopeful that we will, and I'm also not being blindly positively optimistic that things are going to shift, because there's a possibility that this may just be an experience that some integrate and others just revert back to their norm.
Well, I think that last bit you said is going to ultimately be the reality, but I love what you said about, how many people are going to revert back, and how much this is shifting the business dynamic and dynamic of the world. So here's my question, right? Because I think this has a lot to do with it. How long do you think the time of this, the duration of this, is going to have a bigger impact on how many people revert back versus how many people start to integrate?
Mm-hmm. I'd be curious, honestly. I think if this goes on another 3 weeks, I think the longer that, let me say this, I think the longer that this goes on, the higher the possibility of integration is.
I agree with that.
Yeah. So, I mean, when you think of like human nature and habit building, like 30 days is pretty much the minimum across the literature. So I think we're almost there. Like this week, we'll be going on 4 weeks for most people. So again, I'm hopeful that at that point, some people will find ways to integrate. But if this goes on 60, 90 days, 6 months, like then I would be hopeful for a higher percentage.
So I agree. I don't want to forget that other question I have, so I'm just going to, but it's going to take us in a whole other direction because it's goofy. But I just had a thought. So like, what's your least favorite part of the lockdown?
So this is personal. My dad's going through chemo right now, and I haven't seen him in a month, and it's like breaking my heart. And I used to spend Mondays today with him, and I would sit with him during his chemo, and he's there alone right now, and that's really painful for me. And he's like not tech savvy, so he doesn't have like FaceTime or anything. So like we're like just doing old school phone calls. But I would say that that's been like the shittiest part of this whole lockdown is, not being able to support people that I love in the way that I usually do.
Right. And I know, first of all, I mean, my dad had cancer, did chemo, experienced it, definitely a heavy experience. So I feel you in the way that you want to see him and be there in that way. And it's unfortunate that, especially in I'm sure he's in a care facility, some sort of assisted living.
He's actually at home with my mom still, which is a blessing.
Yeah, it is. Because I was going to say, because I know my grandparents, I can't see them for months. Who knows when I'll be able to see them? So yeah, but so it's awesome that he's there.
Yeah, I can't see my mom though because I can't expose my mom because she lives with my dad. It's been interesting. I've basically seen my partner in the last 3 weeks in person.
Right.
But that's about it.
Interesting. I'll share mine. Mine's a little less heavy, but I'm ready to. I really appreciate the going out restaurant experience so much more. I really appreciate just sitting down and just being there and eating food fresher. I don't really like pickup as much. I think it's kind of. Oh, that being said, I've created a new experience with my girlfriend. We just call it like car chat, where we just sit in the car and we just eat for like an hour and a half and just talk. We just pull up to a random parking spot in a random place and just sit and just like listen to music and chat and grub. So we're like trying to find out who has the best takeout, which is in Southern California. Unfortunately, I'm going to be honest, mostly good Mexican food. Everything else haven't had like the greatest thing yet. Anyway, kind of irrelevant, but yeah, no, I think what you were saying earlier about the longer this goes on, the more chance of integration. I think that's true. And so here's my question, because you live in a city. What have you noticed living in the city? Because I know there was like all that hullabaloo about like, we don't have any supplies or like, running through like scarcity, all that kind of stuff. Like, what do you notice? Because you're right in the thick of it. I mean, you're there.
Yeah, I'm right in Philly. So in terms of supplies, we've been fine. Like we're stocked. I mean, there's no toilet paper. It's just random. Like there's no toilet paper. There's tons of food, fresh bananas, apples, all the sweet potatoes you want, bags of spinach. Like, there's the same amount, if not more, food available. It's the It's the paper products that are gone. So that's the only thing I really noticed. Now, on the other hand, what I have kind of appreciated a little bit, like I said, I went on a run today by the water. There are so many people outside, and it is so beautiful to see people of all different ages out, like older people walking and holding hands with their mask, and little kids like learning how to ride a two-wheeler, you know, by the water in the park. Like I saw a family having a picnic in the park, like with hammocks and the trees and a little boombox. And it reminded me of when I was a child, which I haven't seen too much of lately. I've seen it when I traveled in other countries, but I haven't seen it in Philadelphia per se, where I live, to the extent that I'm seeing it now. And it's really nice to see people being more active, being outside, and being more present with their families. So yeah, the only thing that I've seen is no toilet paper and more people on my block. Like I didn't even realize kids lived across the street. There's like 3 of them. Yeah.
Right. A beautiful disaster in a way, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. And that's something I'm sure, I mean, I'm not sure I know for a fact that's something that you're always looking for good and bad in all things, and really trying to see through things so that you can really get a clear picture of what's happening. So, I mean, from your perspective, with this going on longer, what do you think that for those people right now who have yet to really start to do some of that inner work in this time where we need to be on lockdown, what are like some of the most simple, basic things that you'd recommend for them to get started on or give a shot during this time to see if they can build up some momentum and keep this as an actual habit moving forward? Because ultimately, the reason for you that, you know, we talked about this earlier, like COVID-19 is just is really the bully on the playground, but you've never met this bully before. So he pushes you down, or like, you know, pushes you over, et cetera. And you never felt his like push before, her push. So it feels like different. And you're like, oh my gosh, my legs are like paralyzed. So we think, and it's like getting up is a difficult thing, but the more personal development, the more mind, body, spirit stuff you implement, the more inner work you do, the faster you can get up and adapt to these situations. So for those of us who have yet to really start to adapt and realize this might be a piece amount of time, what are some basic things you'd recommend to them to get started with that are simple and easy?
I would tune in. So my answer split. I would tune in and notice which ballpark do you fit in, right? Are you the person who was the doer, the go, 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 I don't have time, do more, be more, productivity? I would say for that person, what the work looks like right now is different than the person who was more lethargic and apathetic and lacked clarity and was stuck in indecision and confusion. The work looks different. So let's start with the doer. Let's start with the busybody. I would say slow down and reflect. So the work might look like actually just acknowledging where you are right now. How does it feel? Are you happy? Are you fulfilled? What brings you joy now, right? What are the areas in your life that are strengths that you can kind of pull back from a little bit and reallocate some of that energy into other areas that might need a little TLC, right? And that might be journaling, meditation, reading a book, using some of the time to have deep conversations with people that feel safe and supportive. It might be going on walks versus going to the gym, blasting dubstep, lifting heavy weights, right? It's how can you just utilize the space you have now to reflect? That might be the first step in the work, because here's the thing with that person that I'd be mindful of. I don't want to tell them to do more, because that's actually easier for them. If I tell them to go to a conference, hire a coach, read a book, do an e-course, they're going to be like, oh, okay, they're going to put it on their to-do list and they're just going to go through it to cross it off, right? So with that person, I'm actually encouraging you to utilize the space to tap in.
I love that. That's fantastic. And I love the way you're breaking this down. Please go on. For those doers out there, stop it.
Stop. Just slow it down a little bit. That's all. We don't have to go 100 all the time, right? So now for the other person, the person that, you know, didn't really utilize the space or have the space or feels fearful or anxious or uncertain or indecisive, I would encourage you to actually use this time and space to do something, like register for the course, hire the coach, like, do the online yoga class. There's so many people stepping up and serving right now for free, right? Like, you can learn yoga, learn meditation. Yale and Harvard are offering free classes right now. Like there's just an abundance of information out there. Read a book, go on YouTube and create a list of influencers or podcasts, and just start listening and learning, and just register the LLC, right? Like, buy the yoga mat, like, just do something and get started and build momentum. That way the habits in place when all of this subsides, so that ideally you can continue with the growth. So with that person, I would just encourage them to start with one thing that's going to move them closer to the thing that they've been waiting to do.
I love that you made this distinction. This is so great. I pray that you make some content about that, because I think that would probably serve people a lot, because I think people don't realize which category they're in. They don't even take the time to think about, like, what category am I a doer? Oh wait, there are people that don't do. They forget. You forget. You're so used to doing. And for the folks that are on the other end of the spectrum, I could do more. That's an interesting thought. Like, who would have thunk it? Like, yeah, dude, we out here. You know what I mean? So I love the way that you broke that down. And I think that the insight into both is really quite brilliant. I really love the idea of just start with one thing that can really, really serve you moving forward. And for the others, do less and stop with the lists, and start to be a little more in the moment and be present amidst the uncertainty. Because yes, I think that there is so much uncertainty, but also at the same token, it's a collective uncertainty. None of us really know what the heck's going on, or how this is going to end, or what this looks like moving forward for the next year. I mean, what if this lasted another year? What would that do, right? And so, like, who knows? I don't think that's going to be the case, but sheesh, to throw anything out the window at this point would be quite it would
premature.
Yeah. So anyway, just I think that's just a great insight, and I'm very grateful, Jess, for all of your insight today, and for all of the really, really, really great information that you have been gifted with the ability to break down in a simplistic format. Because I think there's a lot of things that you broke down today that were really interesting to hear your perspective on it, right? Because I got to learn from you, which is the best part about podcasts for sure. And for everyone else listening, wherever they're at all over the world, like, amazing. And then for any therapist that I'm coming across, you can bet your butt I'm going to be directing them here to listen to this, because again, I think the way you bridge that gap is truly remarkable. And I think it's something that you will have many people follow suit. I think that's sort of the evolution in some ways, right? Because I think there's plenty of therapists out there that felt at some point their hands were kind of tied, and they could only do so much and be so much for their clients, when they may have the dreams to do more, right? Which was, for you, when you travel and you experience more, you were like, this is actually what I want. So how do I make this my reality? How do I make this my life, et cetera? So we're definitely going to have more chats coming up. But before you go, I have one last question. I ask everyone this. Yeah. It's very deep, but it's something to think about, and I think everyone can take away from it. But when you're on your deathbed and you're thinking back on a reflection of your life, what is like the one image, one vision, one movie scene that flashes across your mind where it's like, my life was worth it because of this thing?
It's interesting. I think it's the season of life I'm in. But as soon as you said, like, deathbed, like, I just, like, had a moment where I, like, prayed that I can have a marriage and children that I've shown up for completely. It's one of the reasons I transitioned into coaching, so that I can have the lifestyle to be the type of mother I want to be. I love my mother, and she did the best she could, and I'm so grateful for her. She was exactly who I needed in this lifetime. But moving forward, the type of mother I want to be is very different. And so for me, if I can show up and be an amazing partner and mother and servant to my immediate family, and ideally more, that would be the most fulfilling life I could ever have. I
love that answer. Shout out to you. That's very thoughtful, and I love it. And I love that you've cultivated a lifestyle that you want to live moving forward, regardless of other things you could do regardless of dogma, of all those other things out there. And that you've kind of spearheaded your way through since you were 18 to this place now. And again, that was how we started the conversation, right? I didn't know what it was going to look like. Now you have much more of an idea. And 10 years from now, you're like, what's that's going to look like? We talked about that last time. We just know it's going to be a way that you can live the life and let's be honest, die the way that you want to do that. So, right. So right. I love that. And before we move on here, anything that you want to offer during this time and by that, I mean like anything that you think people need to hear moving forward here for the last like 30 seconds, a minute, or whatever you want to do. If there's anything you feel like you need to say or express intuitively, then like, please feel free.
You know, what's interesting. As soon as you said that, the thing that came to mind, which is completely random because we didn't even talk about this, is stay in your lane. Like, I don't know who needs to hear this, but there's so much noise out there. And especially now, I think a lot of people are filling this time with consumption of information, particularly on social media, and they lack the skills to be present in who they are and to honor in terms of their decisions, who they are and what they want and what they need. And so just be mindful that this is your life, your experience, and it doesn't have to be what people are saying it needs to look like and or what makes them feel good, because at the end of the day, we all die. And when you do die, did you live your life for yourself, or did you live your life for others, and or did you try to live someone else's life? And that's just all a disservice. So stay in your lane. There is power in being authentic. There is power in doing what's best for you, and there's power in showing up as yourself. So
Jess, you freaking rock. That was like the greatest ending ever. I'm giving you a high five right now and a virtual hug. You're amazing. And next time sushi's on me when it's all goes, I don't know if I can do the whole takeout sushi thing. That's suspect. I don't know if there's exactly. You know, we want the hot.
Well, I'll be out in Cali. Like I said, I'm out in Cali like once or twice a year, and you're in an area that I haven't been, but I want to visit. And I am so grateful that we linked up right before you left, and I would love to jam out again and have you share more, because I think that you bring a lot of insight, and through our conversations really kind of facilitate deeper sharing and processes within me, and I really appreciate it. That's
100%. Can't wait. I got some nice hills for you all picked out. Oh my gosh, you're gonna hate me. No, it's legit. But afterwards, we will 100% eat some really good authentic Mexican, because they got it here and it's fire. Really good. Like Chipotle, whatever, dude. You know what I mean? Like it's legit. And, you know, I very much appreciate all the kind words. Each one of our discussions is always pulling back layers and breaking things down to a way that more people can understand them. But more importantly, we can understand them as well, so we can learn how to teach them better, right? Teaching versus telling, which we talked about. But with that said, ladies and gentlemen, or I should say this before we go, Jess, where can people find you? I'm going to put it in the bio, but if anyone wants to know where they can find Jess, different areas to find Jess, where can they do that?
Yeah, I mean, you can just go to my website, jessdemarchis.com, but I try to be active on social media, Facebook and Instagram. So my Instagram's Jam Demarchis, my Facebook's Jessica Marie, but if you follow Graham, just find me. I have long curly hair. You can't miss me.
Facts. And it is a signature, I must say. I dig it. So with that said, ladies and gents, we got Jess Demarchis going in today, talking all kinds of things, personal development, enhancing your life and making the most out of this time during coronavirus, and really being the light in that darkness for yourself, and then naturally others as you lead, others follow. We talked about that. So with that said, everybody, much love, be good, be safe, and peace.
Bye.